The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
When Qatar was awarded the rights to host the 2022 World Cup, there was widespread shock and dismay. Since then, FIFA's bidding process has been dogged by allegations of corruption, with many critics pointing to Qatar's human rights abuses as the reason why the country should never have been selected. The tournament's start has only intensified scrutiny. Qatar's rulers may have hoped World Cup fever would distract from human rights concerns, but instead the opposite has happened. Not a day has passed without controversy since the opening game, from LGBT fans being censored for wearing rainbow clothing to Iranian protesters having signs confiscated. It's possible that hosting the World Cup has massively backfired on Qatar. We talked to Nicholas McGeehan from human rights research and advocacy group Fair Square to find out more.
Yeah, so Qatar became known for football in 2010 when it won the right to host the 2022 World Cup. The following year, it purchased Paris Saint-Germain and has spent a lot of money turning that club from not a particularly powerful force to one of the leading forces in European football. And that's been one of the ways that I think they have certainly tried to burnish their image. I'm not sure that the Qatar World Cup wasn't really an attempt to sports wash, to use that term. I mean, when they won the right to host it, not many people knew about Qatar. Not many people knew where the country was, let alone about its labour system or some of the laws that are enforced there. So it was really, more than anything, I think it was an attempt to put itself in the global spotlight. Now, of course, since it won the right to host that, it's come under all sorts of criticisms. And in that sense, the hosting of the World Cup is a brilliant way for them to project a very positive reputation and image of the country around the world. So it's a complicated picture. Some of it's sports washing, some of it's, I would say, is not about reputation, but is about putting itself on the map globally.
It's been suggested that hosting the World Cup might have a positive impact on Qatar, leading to the introduction of more liberal values through the influx of sports tourists.
I think it is very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous to say that a sporting tournament is going to change the political forces in a country, or is going to change the attitudes or the cultures in any one country. Certainly Qatar, like many of the Gulf states, has a problematic record on human rights. It's got a bad record on women's rights, it's got a bad record on LGBT issues, and it treats migrant workers pretty appallingly. I think what football can do, or what sport can do, and is leveraged to do, is to look at the issues that are directly linked to the sport itself. So in this case, I would say that's migrant workers' rights. And I think in those cases, yes, you can hope to make some gains and to get more progressive laws in place. I think when it comes to other issues, more complex issues, social issues, sport, football, even the West, has to be very careful about how it approaches these issues, and that we be realistic about what sport can and can't achieve, and also not be seen to be too to be lecturing really from a sort of a moral high point. So I think there's a little bit of danger in that, I think, and the argument that sport will necessarily lead to a more liberal or more tolerant societies, I think that's probably unproven as yet. I think within the discourse here, of course, there's Islamophobia. I mean, there's Islamophobia within the Western media on all issues relating to Islam in the Arab world. And of course, there's a degree of Western hypocrisy in how we treat that part of the world, as there's Western hypocrisy in how we treat most parts of the world. But I think what's different about this, and I think why those arguments sit a little uneasily with me, is this is about a World Cup. A World Cup brings a particular spotlight on it. It brings a massive amount of media attention. And much of that media attention is coming from sports writers, right? Now, these sports writers are writing, I think, very good pieces. And I think often what's happening is what people are mistaking is that a lot of this criticism isn't just about Qatar, it's about FIFA. It's about the way sport is run. And it's the job of sports writers to write pieces like this and to hold the sport accountable. And to be honest, I think most of them are doing it really very well. Of course, within the coverage, there's stuff that's dreadful. You know, there's stuff that reproduces harmful stereotypes about this part of the world. Of course, it's in there. But to argue that it's driving the coverage, I think is just wrong. I don't think it's just wrong. I think it's dangerous because it's an argument that's been put forward by the Qatari state. It's an argument that it's a very well-funded PR operation behind it. And it's an argument that is being used to deny migrant workers who have suffered the brunt of this World Cup, is to deny them justice. So I think, yes, let's talk about Western hypocrisy. Yes, let's talk about Orientalism, but let's not make the jump to say that everything that is being thrown at Qatar is because of these. Qatar's getting criticism because it maintains a horrendous system of discrimination against a massive and deeply vulnerable population whom it exploits and abuses dreadfully. That's the main point, and that's the main reason they're getting criticism. And to be honest, they deserve every column inch of criticism that they're getting for that.
But it's not all completely negative. As a result of World Cup scrutiny, Qatar has abolished the kafala system, a framework which gives employers control over their workers' passports.
Yeah, well, Qatar's an interesting country, right? And it's a complex country, like every country, like our country is complex. In the Gulf context, what Qatar's been known for is being slightly more open and more tolerant. So there is a space for free expression in Qatar that doesn't exist in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia, for example. On that score, I think it does quite well. It's a very conservative society, so women's rights are restricted. LGBT plus people suffer repression and discrimination, and those are very serious problems. I think probably its most problematic human rights issue is, in my view anyway, and other views are obviously out there, it is the treatment of the migrant workers, because A, it is needless, B, it is particularly dreadful the way that they are treated, and C, it's happening on a massive scale. This World Cup led to almost probably about 1 million migrant workers being brought into the country, and we're talking about a population that was 1.7 million at the time that won the right to host the tournament. So, I mean, all in all, what I would say is, I think the depiction of Qatar as this exceptionally abusive Gulf state is wrong. It's not. Actually, in many respects, it has a better record than some of its neighbours. But that is not to detract from the fact that on many fronts, its treatment of vulnerable people and minorities, whether they be sexual minorities or migrant workers who are a sort of racial minority, it's just pretty awful. The Gulf states, all of the Gulf states, are essentially monarchies. So Qatar is an emirate, has an emir, it's like a king, and these are the people who wield the most control. I mean, it's not that all power is concentrated in the emir's hands. That's not strictly true. I mean, he tends to rule by consent almost. So the Gulf states are typically, we'd often have a lot of coups in these countries whereby other members of the family will depose somebody and essentially take power. So these monarchs have to wield power very carefully in order to make sure that they don't annoy the Qatari population. But it is certainly true that they are essentially unelected monarchs, and a vast amount of power is centralised in their hands. So they can dictate to a large extent both domestic and foreign policy of the state, and they're hugely influential, which is why, take Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi. These are always very powerful men, and they rule, in some cases, with quite an iron fist.
The level and intensity of the criticism has taken Qatar by surprise, and considering they paid an estimated $300 billion for a PR stunt that didn't quite work out, the Emir of Qatar might be feeling a degree of regret.
I don't think they expected this level of criticism. And I think there will be many in the country, particularly ordinary Qataris, a lot of whom probably just didn't want this World Cup, are just sick to the back teeth of being in the spotlight and have everything in the country scrutinised to the nth degree by the international media. That must be very difficult to handle, I think, for normal Qataris. In terms of will they regret it, it's hard to say. I mean, if you talk about sports washing, right? Sports washing isn't about necessarily just deflecting attention from all of a country's bad spots. It's about narratives, right? And for every bad story you get about your country, you can be guaranteed you'll get a couple of good ones too. So it's a cost-benefit thing. And I think the Qataris will be looking at all this negative stuff right now and wondering very hard if this has all been worth it. But they're also going to attract a lot of positive press, particularly in the coming weeks when this tournament really gets into full swing. The name Qatar is going to be synonymous. Many young people watching that right now aren't going to remember migrant worker abuses or the LGBT scandals. They'll just remember the goals, they'll remember the logos, they'll remember the skyline of Doha. So that country is going to be burned into the memory of lots of people all around the world. And so I think before we hastily say that, you know, this has been a disaster for Qatar, bear in mind that there'll be long-term positive impacts for the country for this World Cup. So I guess in short, I would say the jury's probably out just now. Yeah, no, I think if you're a public relations executive right now, okay, you're watching this very closely, you're watching how the media coverage has gone. That country has spent millions on public relations and still the bulk of the coverage is negative. So I think that is going to send a lot of signals to people about what you can expect from now on if you host one of these tournaments. Bear in mind, a lot of people are saying that, you know, Western coverage is hypocritical, there wasn't coverage of previous events and so on. You can make those arguments and we can have that debate, but what has happened with this tournament is I think a standard has been set, and the media that is now covering these events will look to Qatar, will look how it held Qatar accountable for these things, and will have to come up to scratch the next time something like this happens. So I think the one state that will be looking at this with a degree of trepidation is Saudi Arabia, which is trying to host the 2030 World Cup. And I think they'll be looking at this and wondering what they need to do to make sure they're not subject to the same level of criticism as Qatar has been. Well, I mean, Qatar has put in place some impressive labour reforms on paper. You know, I mean, they've abolished the kafala system on paper. So, you know, you would hope that maybe this attention would, you know, lead them to the conclusion that they need to hasten up the implementation of that reform. I do worry, though, that the polarisation of the debate with Qatar feeling under attack and pushing back very aggressively, I do worry that might not be a situation that's conducive to particularly positive outcomes here. I mean, from my perspective, as someone who's been working on migrant workers' rights for a very long time, I'm very pleased that people know about this issue and that you talk about kafala now and people know what you're talking about. I think that's a positive. But you really hope that the awareness translates into momentum and actual reforms, and as yet we haven't seen that. So maybe I'll feel more optimistic once the tournament's over. But for now, not so much. FIFA's a huge problem here. You know, it was FIFA who awarded the tournament to Qatar. They didn't do any due diligence, and at every step of the way, when abuses came up, FIFA didn't really do anything. You know, they just sort of said, well, it's a few bad apples, and consistently refused to use the influence and the leverage that it has to do more, to do better. I do think that people are going to start talking about whether or not FIFA is an appropriate organisation to govern world football, or whether we actually need radical reform of sports governance in general. It's not just FIFA. You know, you could talk about the International Olympic Committee, for example, another organisation with problems. But yeah, the way things are going, I don't think this is repeatable. I don't think this is sustainable. And at the root of it is FIFA. So I think some very interesting conversations need to be had with not just reform at the heart of them, but radical reform and a complete overhaul of the way that we govern this game.